You might notice that on the watercolour shelves that there are paints that look two different sizes. This is a full pan and these are half pans. The synthetic brushes are fine, and in fact, once again, let you into a secret, I prefer them. Paper can be very confusing. You might notice that on the watercolour shelves that there are paints that look two different sizes. Well, the reason for that is that the companies that make the paints in the UK, there are two main ones. That's Winsor & Newton and Daler Rowney. They tend to make a student quality range and an artist quality range. Now, Winsor & Newton, their student quality range is called Cotman, whereas the Daler Rowney company, theirs is called Aquafine. And you'll see that they are 8mm tubes and they are considerably bigger than the artist quality, which are 5mm. You can buy 21mm of the student quality, but I wouldn't actually do that for the simple reason that if you don't use it a lot, they can dry up in the tube. Now there will be a difference in quality, but not a great lot. And I'm so used to what these paints do now that I tend to sort of ping back to them all the time, even though I do use different paints, I use different makes and I use different qualities, but I know exactly what the student quality do. So don't be frightened of using those. And if you've got artist quality and you've got lots of paints already, then use them. But if not, if you're just starting out, then I would suggest to start with the student quality range. They're cheaper, they're usually a flat standard rate, and the artist quality, it depends on what series they are. So they're the tubes of paint, and I tend to use tubes all the time because there are what they call pans. Let me just show you. This is a full pan and these are half pans, and you get them in little boxes like this, and they're brilliant for sketchbook work or when you're outside doing outdoor work, en plein air as they call it. And as you can see, this has been well used, and in fact I used it when I was up in Uist in the Outer Hebrides on a very cold and very windy January morning, I kid you not, and there's still sand in here. So yeah, great for that, but I don't use it for my main pictures for the simple reason I can't get enough paint out into my palette, and that's where the tubes come in. Okay, so if you have to make a choice, buy the tubes. If you can buy both, then maybe use these for sketchbook work. The only other paint that you're going to need is what they call gouache, and it's just one tube of white, permanent white gouache. Okay, now gouache is similar to watercolour in as much that it's soluble with water, it's made in a similar way, but it has the addition of like a chalk which makes the colours opaque, so they're like poster colours. And the reason we need this is that we use this to flick and splatter paint on at the end. Now I also use a bit of white acrylic ink for the spattering at the end, but the trouble with this is it's permanent, so once it's on, it's on. But it is slightly better than the gouache in as much as it's brighter, because what will happen with the gouache is as it dries it does sometimes go a bit pale and a bit grey looking. So if you wanted to try this, do, but remember that once it's on, it's on. You can't wash it off. Okay, so I will just move those out of the way and we'll just talk about brushes. Now, as you can see from my brushes, I'm not very good at looking after them. So it's a question of doing what I say and not as I do. You shouldn't leave your brushes in the water pot like I do, because it begins to flake off. But you don't need to buy sable unless you've got them, or unless you want them, or unless you want to put them on a Christmas list. The synthetic brushes are fine. And in fact, once again, let you into a secret, I prefer them because as a student I couldn't afford sable, and I know what these will do, because when you wet these and then you let go, they ping back to a point when they're wet, whereas a sable will stay like that. So it's a question of what you're used to, and I'm used to these, and I'm used to student watercolour. But they do need to be good quality brushes. So you can't just use some of these brushes that you find in these bargain shops. They've got to be good quality watercolour synthetic brushes. Okay, so you don't need to buy sable, you can buy synthetic, because there is a lot of snobbery out there with art, but they need to be the best synthetic brushes that you can buy. And I use 4. I use a round brush, I don't use a flat brush, and I use a number 12. The higher the number, the bigger the brush. I use a number 6, I use a number 2, and I use a number 1 rigger. And a rigger has very long bristles and will do beautiful wave patterns. And I believe it's called a rigger as it was invented for marine artists to do rigging on ships. That sounds very feasible to me. The only other brush you might need, or you might want to buy, is a big wash brush, just to get water on. But do you know what? A sponge will do the same thing, a kitchen sponge. Paper. Paper can be very confusing. You could go into a shop and you could look at some of these pads, and on the front it'll say knot or rough or HP or 140 or 300, or it's a block, and you think, blimey, what am I buying here? So let me just explain. Watercolour paper is weighed by the ream, and I'm not sure how many sheets there are in a ream. It's 400 and something. So a £90 paper, £90 is very thin, whereas a £300 paper is almost like a cardboard. Now they do a middle of the road weight. I'll just put this over here. And this is £140. And that's a good one to start with. It's not too thick, it's not too thin. But then you have different surfaces. So as I was mentioning, you might see something that says HP, which means hot press. Basically, it just means smooth. Then it could say rough, speaks for itself. It's got quite a rough texture. But the one I use like this is a middle of the road, not too rough, not too smooth. And the actual title for that is knot. It's really confusing, N-O-T. And I once had a student ring me up in a shop saying, Ruth, I'm here, I'm ready to buy my paper, but it actually says not watercolour paper on the front of the pad. And I'm so confused. So I had to explain that knot is actually the title of the surface. Okay, I usually get A3 for when I'm teaching, but because I normally paint big, I get them in loose sheets at A1, because then you could always cut them down. You could cut them down into 4, or you could cut them down into 2 and work at A2. So think about what you're going to want to be doing. Are you going to want to work big, or are you going to be working small most of the time? If you are going to be working small, you could buy them in a pad. Now you might find a pad that says it's a watercolour block. Now a block is actually glued all the way around, except for a very small bit where you can get a knife underneath and just cut the top piece of paper off when you've finished your painting. And that is instead of what they call stretching your paper. Now stretching your paper is where you actually glue it onto a board. If you do want to stretch it like I do, you will need a board. I'll talk about that in a minute. And you will need some old-fashioned gum strip. It can't be this plastic equivalent. It's got to be the stuff that you wet, because we're going to wet the paper, run it under the tap, and then we're going to actually glue it down. And then that dries flat overnight, and it will dry completely flat. And then you can work on it, and then when you've finished your when you've finished your painting, you just cut it off your board, and then your board's ready to go again, and your paper's nice and flat. Okay, so the board you would need if you're going to be doing that, I do this all the time. I don't use blocks. I have lots of different size boards, but it does need to be a reasonable thickness. Okay, it needs to be, I don't know what that is, 1/4 of an inch, you know, a reasonable thickness, because when the paper is actually drying, paper is incredibly strong, and it will actually make your paper bow. And it'll make your board bow, sorry. So you do need a board that's a little bit thicker. Now I tend to just use MDF or plywood, and you can just get an offcut from a timber merchant. You don't need to spend a lot of money on that. So you've got your board, you've got your paper, you've got your paints. Let's get them all out here. You've got your white gouache, you've got your brushes. And now you need a palette. And a palette is an important thing that you're going to need because we're going to need lots and lots of paint. So you'll find these palettes that are that size but with little wells. They're no good, and you don't want just a plain plate. You need several wells and big wells, and I tend to put my paint in here and mix around the outside. And it's a good idea to have two because you might actually overspill into another one. It's quite rare, but you might do that. So you've got your palettes there. So they're the main things that you're going to need, but there are going to be just a few other things that you'll have to just look for. The first one you've probably already got hanging about is an old toothbrush, and that will be just to flick and spatter white paint on at the end. And you will need some tissue or some kitchen roll. You'll just need it generally, but also sometimes we will just actually lift off some paint if you've put too much on. Water pots, just jam jars are fine. I tend to use two, one for clean water and one for dirty water. We've talked about the gum strip, which you're going to need. We've talked about the ink, okay. So you're also going to need some table salt, and this is difficult to explain the effect, but when you sprinkle this into a damp wash you get a lovely, lovely mottled effect, which is brilliant for water and splashes. You could experiment with rock salt, salt flakes, but make sure you've just got some bog standard table salt as well. You will also need some cling film, or some plastic wrap it's called in America, because when we lay this on a wet wash you'll get some great patterns, and it just takes all the hard work out of painting the sea. I do have an issue with it being a single-use plastic, but I can't find an alternative. So what I do try to do is to at least reuse it a few times before it's well past its best. Okay, so then you've got your water pot, and you will need a white pastel. It has to be a good quality one. This is a company called Unison. You can buy them individually, whereas a lot of pastels you'd have to buy in a set. So just buy one of those. And I think that is probably about it. Oh, we'll just talk about this. I have a spray bottle. In a damp wash, if you spray it with water, you can get lots of little white dots, which is really nice. And it gives it a really nice sort of mottled effect.